the process of change is not a one-day affair. It's not a one-day affair. Struggle is not an electric switch. It's not something you go on the wall and flick a switch and you have electricity.
Pan-African greetings, dear comrades all over the world, and welcome to another special edition of the Ubuntu Pulse. The Ubuntu Pulse is a podcast series by Africans Rising that captures stories of resilience, resistance, and hope, and brings together very amazing guests to just share with us their journey and with the hope of inspiring other Africans. So today we have a very special guest who is joining us today. He is a movement person. He's an activist. He's a writer, Sungu Oyooo. We are going to be discussing with him, but most specifically, we'll be looking at his journey from grassroots organizing, from activism to politics. So who is Sungu Oyooo? Sungu Oyooo is a writer and activist. He is a presidential candidate in the 2027 Kenyan general elections. He is the Director of Spatial Programs and Organizational Development at Wanko, a Pan-African popular pedagogy collective, and also serves as national spokesperson for Kongamano la Mapinduzi, a political movement in Kenya. Sungu has previously been part of various campaigns, movements, and organized groups working towards the attainment of social, economic, and environmental rights across the African continent, including the Rewrite History campaign, a Pan-African and global campaign by Africans Rising that demanded reparations by examining the legacies of slavery and colonialism. His writings have appeared in various publications, including Pambazuka News, Okumbuzi Review, The Elephant Rope, that's the Review of African Political Economy, Progressive International, This is Africa, and The Daily Nation, amongst others. His first collection of poetry, titled Abolish Everything, a Poetic Manifesto from Last Evening, was published in 2024. So, Sungu, thank you so much again for joining us in this episode of the Ubuntu Pulse. And I think that many people know your activism, but not everyone actually knows the journey that brought you here. And that takes me to my very first question to you. Can you take us back and tell us, how did this journey into activism begin? What's the story?
Thank you, Ansel. I think my journey into activism began in the student movement from when I was at the University of Nairobi, and we were part of the Students' Organization of Nairobi University. That's slightly over a decade ago, I think around 2010 or so, when we were young students. But beyond that, we were able to connect the student organizing, which was around our immediate issues, with wider organized society, with the social movements, Kenyans for Tax Justice, Bunge la Mwananchi, and other movements, and to immerse our struggles in the concrete in society. And I think it's really been a journey that's both fulfilling and also painful at times. But I think one of the best things that happened to us was also the ability to connect our national level organizing within the movement, with organizing at the Pan-African level and with movements at the Pan-African level.
Yeah. Oh, beautiful. So now you're sharing this story, and I'm wondering, was there a moment or an experience that really shaped your political consciousness?
I think my consciousness was shaped first and foremost during the student protests of 2010. And over the course of this protest, because we were in the student movement, we were able to realize the raw brutality of the state. But beyond that, beyond the physical violence, we were also victims of economic violence from the state, whether it was through the mechanisms through which our tuition would be funded, whether it was us looking at our living conditions within the university, and trying to compare and contrast this with the kind of society we wanted or the world we be transitioning it into after university. I think that moment for me was really key in terms of shaping my worldview and in terms of raising my consciousness as an individual. And I'm glad it happened as part of a wider political process, bringing thousands and thousands of young Kenyans together.
Yeah, so thank you for sharing that, and it's really good to hear how you were able to journey into this into activism, and how you moved started from the student movement right up to where you are to now, where you are today. So now let's talk about being a part of movements like Africans Rising. You know, you've also when we read about you, we saw how much you contributed to the Rewrite History campaign. But how does being part of movements like Africans Rising and other movements you have mentioned, how has that influenced how you understand power and people's struggle?
I think all struggle is about power in terms of who wields power, who and how that power is exercised and who that power benefits in society. Uh, One of my favorite lines, though most of the time it doesn't exercise, it doesn't feel quality, is the first article of Kenya Constitution, which states that all sovereign power belongs to the people. And I think that extends beyond the Constitution. Because in real sense, all power belongs to the people. The people are the motive force of history. It is the people who create history. And if it is the people who create history, history is a process of the creation of history is a process of social development. And when people come together as part of movements, Africans Rising or movements at the national level, it is them engaging, playing a conscious part in the creation of this history. And I think movements are called movements because movements move. The word comes from the word move. Like if it's not moving people, it's not moving events, it's not moving processes, then we can't call it a movement. And so for our movements like Africans Rise that are consciously part of this process of creating new worlds, part of this process of creating better worlds, for instance, for African people, then we can inherently say that these are movements that are immersed to a large extent in a struggle for power because it's at the end of the day, all these struggles are about who has the power and who the power benefits.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that. And your activism has also not only been local, you've been deeply engaged in the wider East African region, and which brings me to the next part of my question. How would you describe the current political moment in East Africa? We've seen that there's strong civic resistance in Kenya, alongside repression in Uganda very much just recently, and then there's Tanzania. What patterns do you see emerging? And in your view, what are the deeper causes of the political repression that we see today?
East Africa is hostile to progressive forces, and it's not isolated to one country like Uganda or Tanzania. I think across the whole region, there is a very systemic process through which the regimes are collaborating and sharing notes and offering solidarity to each other in terms of what are the best tactics of repression. In Uganda, for instance, you have the opposition leader, one of the opposition leaders, Kiza Besigye, in prison on charges of treason. In Tanzania, for the longest time, the past few years, we've had opposition leader Tundu in prison, facing charges of treason. In Rwanda, Ingabire, the opposition leader, has also been in prison, facing charges of treason. Same to South Sudan, where opposition leader Riek Machar is in prison, facing charges of treason. And so you can see that there is a clear pattern. One of the easiest ways to be charged with treason in East Africa is to be an opposition leader. Burundi has no opposition. because I think the ruling party controls all the seats in parliament. So we cannot talk of a political opposition at an institutional level. Uh, Since the ruling party has usurped powers, Ethiopia is in a state of turmoil. There's war. Dan has been in that state of turmoil for a few years now. There's war. And if you see the new report, I think it was from Reuters or something yesterday, it's about Ethiopia now offering training ground for the uh, Janjaweed rapid RSS who are fighting the Sudanese armed forces in Khartoum. And so we see that in as much as there's this repression at the national level, at a geopolitical level, there's also external actors involved, including the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and the American government that are supplying both support, both in terms of weapons and moral and diplomatic support to these warring factions. Somalia is also largely in a state of conflict and balkanization. They are trying to break it into two different countries because of its strategic position at the Horn of Africa. In Kenya, there still is a state of depression because since the Gen Z uprising in 2024, we can't say that the state or the country returned to a state of normalcy. Abductions have continued, killings have continued, and the atmosphere is generally repressive, and even the democratic space has really shrunk. For example, the party I belong to, Kweli Party, the Registrar of Political Parties, which is a government institution, sent us a note citing their intention to deregister the party early on in February. And actually, we are now with court struggling to rescue this, which should be our political instrument. And so I think the region really is hostile. I don't think there is a country that spared this
region, definitely. And I'm happy that you just mentioned the Gen Z protest. So let's talk about the reaction or the response from citizens and movements. Do you think that now citizens and movements are responding differently now as compared to maybe 10 years back or several years ago?
I think there is a difference at a tactical level. At a strategic level, there is not much difference because the strategy, the overarching objective has always been to create new societies, better societies that can guarantee peace, that can guarantee justice, that can guarantee dignity. At a practical level, I think there is a change of the methods and processes that people are using. There is a resurgence of protests, especially in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, like mass protests, which are preceded by mass mobilization efforts to ensure that people show out. But the overall political climate in this political landscape has remained the same because one, it is a highly repressive region that is not spoken about much. But at the same time, we know that repression breeds resistance. That is the dialectic of history. It's how history moves. Like when you increase repression, resistance to that also increases. In as much as there's all this repression, there also is a high level of resistance. And we see increasingly organized groups and movements coming together. So in Kenya, I'm a member of Kongamano la Mapinduzi, which is a political movement. But last year, more than 20 movements and organized fronts came together under the Kenya Left Alliance, such that we could have a single umbrella guiding our actions at the national level, which I think is the way to go because we should the movements and organizations should look more at what unites them, the points of unity that exist between them, and move those forward while looking at ways of rescuing the differences that exist between them.
And I think that's definitely the ideal. Like we always say, if we want to go far, we have to go together. You know, if you want to go fast, you can go alone. But if you want to go far, you need to go together. And that's actually the spirit behind that. But now let's move to another part of this conversation. Last year, you made a decision that surprised many people. You declared your intention to run for political office, specifically presidency. What motivated you that decision?
First and foremost, I think I come from a political movement, like I stated, Kongamano la Mapinduzi, and we in the political movements believe that political movements and political organizations exist to capture power. And even in our political program of action as an organization, it speaks to that. And we've taken various steps. We did not contest the last election. We are not a registered political party, so we are not contesting, but we are members of political parties, progressive political parties, in whose ideologies we share. And in our process of growing and spreading the movement, we felt that it was at that point, at that historical moment, where we needed to contest for power. And I think that the events of the last 3 years in Kenya have really shown the movements that power only concedes to power. I think is why one of the slogans of the movements in Kenya today, organize to take political power for social justice. The movements are not speaking just about social justice, speaking about taking political power and implementing the tenets of social justice or economic justice that they are talking about. And a study of history will show us, for example, Marx says that political power exists in the service of economic power. And so those who wield economic power inherently have leverage over economic power. And in a society that's highly unequal, like what we see in Kenya today, it then means that we only have a few people basically having the politicians in their pockets. And so what we want to do is to reorient the power structures in society. It's the side that the politics serves the people, and by extension, our political programs are able to institute an economic transformation that shifts the balance of economic power. It's in the economy, because our problems are political across most of our countries in Africa, and their solutions will have to be political. Whether it's a question of water, or a question of healthcare or roads in your neighborhood, you inadvertently find yourself going either like to your local representative or to the local assembly, the municipality. And the people who control these things are elected people. And so one of the ways of bringing into life the ideas that we talk about and that we espouse and that we believe in is to engage in these political processes and actually institute the political change that can come with those positions.
So thank you for sharing so far, comrade. Many activists struggle with whether change actually happens inside or outside formal politics. So how do you carry the grassroots values of accountability, people power, collective leadership into spaces that often resist these things? And sometimes even people talk about the spirit of contamination. People believe that activists and other movement leaders who actually have a vision get contaminated when they get into these spaces. So how do you carry these values into these spaces that are often very resistant to these things?
It's to, I think for me, it's to recognize that there's no mathematical formula to change. Change arises out of our conscious efforts as human beings, and that there are multiple pathways towards creating better societies. We could, for instance, form cooperatives and engage in other economic programs in our communities. We could choose a political pathway and have a solid political program of action which we stick to and which we follow. And so for me, I think there's multiple pathways, but what I was mentioning earlier is that at the most important level, I think, is to be part of an organization which is grounded on a particular set of progressive values, which is grounded in a progressive ideology capable of transforming society, which is grounded in the belief that we as a people deserve better, and that political office or political processes are not just processes to enrich a few in society, but they should be processes for collective advancement and collective liberation from society.
Definitely. I love that. I love that. Definitely something that, and this is why sometimes we even talk about political education, because people need to know that they as citizens deserve better. But let me switch and move again specifically to Kenya, especially the role that Kenya plays in the East African region, whether politically or symbolically. Now, how do you see Kenya's political direction directly influencing the wider East African region? As someone who is rooted in movement work, how do you see that this is going to happen?
At a geopolitical level, Kenya has always occupied in the Eastern Horn of Africa region an important role, both politically and economically. And so most of what happens in the region starts in Kenya. And Kenya as a state, in many ways, is a neo-colonial state. It is a home, or rather, it is a satellite state of imperialism. And so whenever, especially today, where even the nature of capitalism has evolved and we have financialized capital, for any entry to be made, Kenya will be used as the testing ground or starting ground, and then it will cascade to the other countries in East Africa. For example, now you look at efforts around water privatization of water supply networks, and installation of smart meters which deny people the right to water. It's already being rolled out in Kenya. And if it succeeds in Kenya, then in a few years, it will be rolled out in other East African countries. I think it occupies the same role, for example, that South Africa occupies in the southern part of the continent, because even with the water thing, it's also being done in South Africa and I think in Ghana, which are also being used as entry points to those regions. And so at a geopolitical level, we always we really observe the movement of capital in Kenya, the movement of imperialism in Kenya, and know what's coming to the region. At the level of the movements, I think it's more or less the same, whether it's the struggles for national liberation, struggles for multi-party political dispensations in the 80s through to the early 90s, struggles for new constitutions across the region. In many ways, struggles around these issues started in Kenya, and then you see a few years later, the same struggles replicating themselves in the region. For example, in Tanzania now, the struggle for a new constitution is at its apex. And even before the election, it's one of the things that the regime was resisting, and which I think partly contributed to the jailing of the opposition leaders, because the opposition was demanding for a new constitution. And even the protests that we had in Kenya last year, in terms of people coming out and claiming their agency, claiming their power from the dominant power structures in society, we see then a year later, after the Tanzanian election, Tanzanians coming out in huge numbers and saying and literally reclaiming their sovereignty as a people. And so I think it plays a dominant role in terms of predicting what region the movement is moving, both in terms of repression, both in terms of the entry of or the entrenchment of imperialism, and also then in terms of the awakening of processes around people's power and people's organizing.
Nice, thank you. And now let's move back to leadership. And we're talking about ethical, people-centered leadership. What does it look like to you in this moment of Africa's history with so many challenges across the continent? What does people-centered leadership look like to you? And what is that one thing that gives you hope right now?
I think people-centered leadership, just like the name says, I would say a leadership that places people first, a leadership that places the people and their interests first. Because we have to remember most of the nation states on the continent are relatively young, 50 or 60 years or so. Since they gained national independence, or rather, since the end of classical colonialism in those countries. The colonial state was extractive. It condemned our people to poverty, it condemned our people to humiliation, it condemned African people to death across the continent by even if you were only to look at the conditions it consigned them to. The neo-colonial state is created in the image of the colonial state. It also condemns, in many ways, it condemns a majority of Africans to poverty. It condemns them to humiliation. It degrades them and puts them in such poor conditions of living, social and economic conditions of living. And in many ways, it condemns them to death. Because if, for example, you cannot access healthcare, then the state is literally condemning you to death, or you cannot access housing, the most essential of things in society. And so I think we have to, this people-centered politics must be capable of envisioning and building a new society, a society that can guarantee peace, a new world, these new worlds that can guarantee justice, new worlds that can guarantee happiness, can guarantee laughter, because sometimes we don't talk about the simplest of things. And so among our list of demands is that we want to laugh again. As oppressed people, we demand for dignity, and this new world should be capable of offering that dignity. But beyond that, I think a people-centered leadership must also institute programs and processes, especially within our social movements, progressive organizations, progressive political parties, that enable people to again imagine what freedom looks like. Because among the oppressed, it's possible to be oppressed to such an extent that you lose the capacity to imagine the size of freedom. And so African people have to once again imagine what freedom looks like before we can even work towards that freedom. Because we cannot walk towards, or we cannot, our forward march into history has to be towards something definite.
Definitely. So as we wrap up, Sungu, what is that one thing that you would say to young movement leaders, activists who are unsure of whether politics is actually something that they would love to engage in? What would be something that you would say to these people?
I think I would say two things. First, as African people, our primary objective has always been the advancement and the achievement of Pan Africanism. That is first. Pan Africanism birthed African nationalism in the nation states. The Fifth Pan African Congress was able to answer three important questions. One, who are that in 1945, who are our friends? The colonial system and the structures behind it. No, I mean, who are our friends, the masses of our people? Who are our enemies, the colonial system and the structures behind it? What must be done? We must create mass parties as vehicles for national liberation. That was in 1945. And so Pan-Africanism backed African nationalism, and African nationalism should strengthen Pan-Africanism. And I think sometimes that there's always that clash between whether we organize at the Pan-African level or at the national level. I see the two as one and the same thing. The second thing that I would say is that we, historically speaking, African people have faced greater challenges. We faced the challenge of slavery and being enslaved people, which is an atrocity. It's not even a challenge, it's an atrocity. We faced colonialism and be able to overcome this. We now live in the neo-colonial dispensation, and it is up to come up with new frames of organizing that respond to the times and the needs of the people in such a comprehensive manner that we can again overcome the barriers placed in our path today as African people. You know, Marcus Garvey said, we have a beautiful history, but we will create one that will astonish the world. How do we then create this beautiful and radiant future that is capable of transforming society and transforming the world. I think it's to recognize the primacy of the people as the motive force of history. It is the people who create history. It is they who must be at the center of our organizing. And it is they who must be at the center of those progressive processes in our movements, whether it's processes of political education, whether it's processes of organizing communities, and to understand the science behind struggle. And lastly, as I finish, it's to recognize that the process of change is not a one-day affair. It's not a one-day affair. Struggle is not an electric switch. It's not something you go on the wall and flick a switch and you have electricity. Struggle is a protracted process. It can take weeks, it can take months, it can take years, it can take decades. But I think the overall factor that we have to consider at the end of the day of the change is our consistency and how we are able to bring more and more people into our organizing in a manner that also honors them, in a manner that honors society, in a manner that constructively leads toward the creation of that new society we are working toward.
Thank you, comrade. So much wisdom in that advice to our young activists and change makers. So thank you so much, comrade, for not only sharing us these beautiful ideas, but also your journey into activism. And it was such a great pleasure having you today on this episode of the Ubuntu Pulse. To our comrades who are listening to the Ubuntu Pulse for the first time, this is available on All Africans Rising platforms. You can check on YouTube. You'd have a copy of it. And you can also check on our social media platforms for inserts. So thank you, comrade, for coming. Thank you to our comrades for listening. Please do remember to follow Africans Rising at Africans Rising across all social media platforms and keep in touch. And let's continue with building the Africa that we want. Remember, Ubuntu, I am because you are. Thank you.